The digital clock on the dashboard blinked 5:47 a.m. as Sarah Mitchell's dusty Honda Civic rolled down the empty highway toward Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, bloodshot from the 12-hour overnight drive from Boston. The coffee in her travel mug had gone cold 3 hours ago, somewhere around the Virginia-North Carolina border, but she'd kept driving anyway. Sleep could wait. Duty couldn't. Sarah caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and almost laughed. If her former drill sergeant could see her now, he'd probably have a heart attack. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that had given up any pretense of military regulation around 2 a.m. The oversized Boston University hoodie she wore, a gift from her daughter Emma's graduation yesterday, had a coffee stain on the sleeve. Her jeans were ripped at the knee, not fashionably, but from actual wear. No makeup. No jewelry, except for the simple silver watch her late husband had given her 20 years ago. She looked, for all intents and purposes, like a middle-aged suburban mom who'd taken a wrong turn on the way to Target. Which was exactly why what was about to happen would happen. Sarah yawned, stretching her neck as the first rays of sunrise broke over the pine trees lining the highway. The GPS announced, "In half a mile, turn right onto All-American Freeway." Her stomach fluttered, not with nerves but with anticipation. Fort Bragg, home of the 82nd Airborne Division, and as of today, her command. 27 years of service had led to this moment. She'd enlisted as a scared 21-year-old private, worked her way through officer candidate school, survived 3 combat deployments, earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star, commanded at every level from platoon to brigade, and shattered more glass ceilings than she could count. And now, at 48 years old, she was about to become the first female commanding general of the 82nd Airborne. The ceremony wasn't scheduled until 10 a.m. The base commander's office had sent her the itinerary: arrival at 9:30 hours, brief rest period, uniform inspection, then the formal change of command ceremony at 1,000 hours sharp. There would be press, dignitaries, a 3-star general flying in from the Pentagon. It was going to be a whole production. But Sarah had never been good at waiting, and after sitting through Emma's 3-hour graduation ceremony, then the family dinner that stretched until midnight, then the tearful goodbye in the dorm parking lot, she'd made an impulsive decision. She'd drive through the night, get to Bragg early, maybe catch a few hours of sleep in her new quarters before the circus began. She hadn't told anyone she was coming early. That was mistake number 1. The entrance to Fort Bragg appeared ahead, a sprawling military installation that covered over 160,000 acres. Sarah had been here before, of course, multiple times over her career, but never like this. Never as the commander. She felt a surge of pride mixed with the weight of responsibility. 3,000 soldiers would be under her command. 3,000 lives that would depend on her decisions. She slowed the Civic as she approached the main gate. The guardhouse was lit up and she could see figures moving inside. Morning shift change, probably. She reached for her purse on the passenger seat, fishing for her military ID. The new one had just arrived last week with her updated rank, Major General, 2 stars. That's when she noticed them. 3 soldiers stood outside the guardhouse, and something about their posture immediately caught her attention. Too rigid, too eager. They moved like puppies who'd just been let off the leash, all energy and no discipline. Sarah's experienced eye cataloged the details in seconds. Brand new uniforms with creases so sharp they could cut paper, boots so shiny they reflected the rising sun, name tapes that still had that fresh from the package look. Recruits, very new recruits. The tallest one, a blonde kid who couldn't be more than 19, spotted her car and immediately straightened up, saying something to his companions. All 3 turned to face her approaching vehicle. The blonde one, she could see his name taped now, Morrison, planted his feet wide and crossed his arms across his chest. Oh boy, Sarah thought, here we go. She'd seen this type before. Young, male, pumped full of testosterone and the intoxicating drug of wearing a uniform for the first time. They thought the uniform made them powerful, made them men, made them authorities. They hadn't yet learned that the uniform was a responsibility, not a right. That respect was earned through actions, not automatic because of what you wore. Sarah rolled down her window as she pulled up to the gate, offering a friendly smile despite her exhaustion. The morning air was already humid, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of reveille playing from somewhere deep in the base. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, reaching for her ID. Morrison stepped forward, his hand shooting up in a stop gesture. He didn't even look at her face, his eyes dismissing her car, her appearance, her very presence in one contemptuous sweep. "Ma'am, this entrance is for military personnel only," he announced, his voice dripping with the kind of authority only someone with 48 hours of service could muster. "The visitor center is 3 miles back, off exit 56. Sarah's hand paused, her ID halfway out of her purse. She looked at the young private, really looked at him. Saw the cocky tilt of his chin, the way he'd positioned himself to block her path, the smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Behind him, his 2 companions were watching, waiting to see how this would play out. 27 years of experience told Sarah exactly what was happening. They saw a woman in a beat-up car, dressed in civilian clothes, approaching a military base at an odd hour. They'd made their judgment in 3 seconds flat. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, not anger, not yet, but something close. A familiar feeling, the same feeling she'd had as a young lieutenant when a colonel patted her head and called her sweetheart. The same feeling from the time a sergeant refused to take orders from her until her male counterpart repeated them. The same feeling from 1,000 small moments across nearly 3 decades of service. She took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. "Son, if you just look at my identification." "Did you just call me son?" The voice came from the second recruit, an Asian-American kid whose name tape read CHEN. He stepped forward now, joining Morrison, and Sarah could see the dynamic shifting. They were feeding off each other's energy, escalating. This was going south fast. Private Tyler Chen stepped closer to the Honda Civic, his shoulders squared in a way that was supposed to look intimidating, but just looked awkward. At 20 years old, with barely 2 days in uniform, he was riding high on the power trip that came from standing at a gate with the authority to say no to civilians. "Did you just call me son?" he repeated, his voice louder now. "Lady, do you know where you are?" Sarah's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but her expression remained neutral. She'd been in situations where actual enemy combatants had pointed weapons at her. 3 overconfident kids weren't going to rattle her, but she was fascinated, in a clinical way, watching them dig their hole deeper. "I'm aware of where I am, Private," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that anyone with experience would have recognized as a warning. "And I'm asking you, politely, to examine my credentials before." "Before what?" Morrison cut her off, leaning down toward her window now. His coffee breath hit her face, and Sarah resisted the urge to wrinkle her nose. "Before you what, exactly? You gonna complain to my supervisor?" The third recruit, Marcus Williams, a stocky African-American kid from the name tape, laughed out loud at that. "Oh man, Karen wants to speak to the manager." Sarah's jaw clenched. There it was. The Karen slur that had become shorthand for dismissing any woman who dared to assert herself. She'd heard it before, though never in uniform, never from someone under her command. The disrespect was breathtaking in its casualness. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, and her voice dropped into what her subordinates called her command tone, the one that made colonels straighten their spines. "I am going to say this one time. Check my identification." But Morrison was on a roll now, feeding off his friend's laughter and his own inflated sense of importance. He straightened up, crossing his arms. "The only thing I need to check is whether you're going to turn this car around voluntarily, or whether we need to call the MPs to escort you off federal property." Chen pulled out his radio with a flourish like an actor in a bad cop movie. "Gate 3 to dispatch. We have a non-compliant civilian at the main entrance, possibly hostile, requesting backup." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Hostile? Are you serious right now?" "You're refusing to follow lawful orders from military personnel," Williams chimed in, moving around to the back of her car. "That makes you hostile in my book." This was escalating faster than Sarah had anticipated. She glanced at the guardhouse and could see through the window that there was supposed to be a supervisor, a sergeant, judging by the rank visible on the uniform hanging on the back of a chair. But the small bathroom door was closed, a sliver of light visible underneath. Whoever was supposed to be supervising these three had picked the worst possible moment for a bathroom break. Sarah made a calculation. She could pull rank right now, turn this into a teaching moment immediately. But part of her, the part that had spent decades watching young soldiers make mistakes, wanted to see how far they'd take this. Not out of spite, but because sometimes the best lessons were the ones that hurt a little. "I'm not refusing anything," Sarah said evenly. "I'm trying to show you my ID, which you keep refusing to look at." "Because we don't need to see it," Morrison shot back. "This isn't complicated, lady. Military base, military entrance. You're clearly not military." He gestured at her car, her clothes, her entire appearance with obvious disdain. "So unless you've got some kind of special authorization, which I seriously doubt, you need to turn around and use the civilian entrance like everyone else." "Everyone else," Chen added with a smirk. "You know, the normal people who don't think they're special." Sarah felt a flash of genuine anger now, but she kept it locked down tight. In her years of service, she developed an almost supernatural ability to control her emotions. It was necessary. A woman who showed anger was emotional or hysterical, while a man showing the same emotion was passionate or strong. She'd learned to channel everything into an icy calm that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "Private Morrison," she said, reading his name tape again. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to look at my identification. After that, what happens next is on you." But Morrison had crossed a line in his own head where backing down would mean losing face in front of his buddies. Sarah recognized it, that moment when ego overrode common sense, when the need to be right trumped everything else. "You know what, lady?" Morrison put his hand on her car door, actually touched her vehicle. "I'm done asking nicely. You've got 10 seconds to back this car up and leave, or I'm calling the MPs and having you arrested for trespassing on federal property. Your choice." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Touching her car was technically an assault. This kid had no idea how much trouble he was in, but before she could respond, Williams had moved fully behind her vehicle, blocking any exit. "Can't back up now anyway," Williams called out. "Looks like we're doing this the hard way." Chen was speaking into his radio again, with more urgency now. "Dispatch, civilian is refusing all orders to vacate. We need MP support at Gate 3 immediately." The crackle of radio static filled the morning air, and Sarah could hear the confused response. "Gate 3, confirm. You have an actual security threat." "Affirmative," Chen responded, puffing his chest out. "We've got a hostile civilian who refuses to identify herself and is attempting to gain unauthorized access to the base." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. She was refusing to identify herself. She'd been trying to show them her ID for the past 5 minutes. "Listen," she said, trying one last time. "I understand you're doing what you think is your job, but I am ordering you." "Ordering?" Morrison's laugh was cruel, mocking. "Oh, this is rich. Karen here thinks she can give us orders." He leaned down into her window again, his face inches from hers. "Lady, the only thing you're qualified to order is a pumpkin spice latte at Starbucks. Now get the hell off our base before this gets ugly." That's when Sarah heard it, the sound of boots pounding on pavement, running fast. She looked past Morrison to see a Hispanic sergeant burst out of the guardhouse bathroom, still adjusting his belt. His face was flushed, and he was looking down at a clipboard as he ran. "Morrison, Chen, Williams, what the hell is?" Sergeant Rodriguez looked up, and his eyes landed on Sarah's face through the car window. The clipboard clattered to the ground. Rodriguez's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confusion to recognition to absolute horror, in about 2 seconds flat. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Oh my God," he whispered, then louder, "Oh my God, oh no, 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 no." The 3 recruits turned to look at their supervisor, confused by his reaction. "Sarge," Morrison said uncertainly, "we've got this under control. This civilian was trying to—" "Stand down," Rodriguez's voice cracked with panic. "All 3 of you stand down right now." But the recruits just looked at each other, bewildered. They had no idea what was happening, no idea that the woman in the Honda Civic wasn't just any civilian. And then they heard it, the low rumble of heavy vehicles approaching from inside the base. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive sound of diesel engines and heavy tires on asphalt. Sarah could see the confusion on the 3 recruits' faces as they turned toward the noise. Sergeant Rodriguez had gone completely white, frozen in place like a deer in headlights. "What's going on?" Williams asked, his earlier confidence wavering. But Rodriguez couldn't speak. He just stood there, staring at Sarah with the expression of a man watching his career explode in slow motion. Morrison, still operating on pure bravado and completely misreading the situation, turned back to Sarah with renewed aggression. "I don't know who you think you called, lady, but backup doesn't help you. You're still trespassing." Sarah said nothing. She simply sat back in her seat, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Her face was serene, almost peaceful. Anyone with military experience would have recognized that expression, the calm before the storm. But these 3 kids had no idea what they were looking at. 3 Humvees rounded the corner from inside the base, moving fast. They weren't just any Humvees. These were command vehicles, marked with flags and insignia. The lead vehicle screeched to a halt about 20 feet from the gate, and Sarah could see the panic on Rodriguez's face intensify. "Oh God, it's Colonel Patterson," Rodriguez breathed. "They sent Patterson." Chen shifted uncomfortably. Even with only 2 days on base, they'd heard about Colonel James Patterson. The man was a legend, a full-bird colonel with 30 years of service, 3 combat tours, and a reputation for running the tightest ship in the 82nd Airborne. He didn't just command respect, he demanded it. The driver's door of the lead Humvee opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite. 6'3", broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut in a high-end type that belonged in a recruiting poster. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and badge perfectly placed. Even his boots seemed to shine brighter than the rising sun. Patterson's eyes swept the scene. The Honda Civic, the 3 recruits, Rodriguez's horrified expression, and then landed on Sarah through the car window. His entire body snapped to attention so rigidly that Morrison actually jumped. "General on deck." Patterson's voice could have been heard in the next county. The word hit the 3 recruits like a physical blow. "General." Morrison's smug expression crumbled. Chen's radio slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering on the pavement. Williams took an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. "No," Morrison whispered. "No, that's not, she can't be." But Patterson was already moving, his stride purposeful and precise. He approached Sarah's car window, and if a human being could physically manifest respect, it was happening right now. His salute was textbook perfect, held with absolute stillness. "General Mitchell, ma'am," his voice carried across the morning air. "Colonel James Patterson, Base Operations Commander. Ma'am, we weren't expecting you until 9:30 hours." Sarah stepped out of her Honda Civic, and it was like watching a transformation scene in a movie. She'd been sitting, tired, rumpled, easily dismissed. But as she stood and stretched to her full 5'9", something fundamental changed in the air around her. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was simply presence, that indefinable quality that comes from decades of command, from making life-and-death decisions, from leading soldiers through hell and bringing them home. Even in ripped jeans and a college hoodie, even with messy hair and no makeup, Sarah Mitchell radiated authority that made the morning air feel heavier. "Colonel Patterson," Sarah acknowledged. Her voice transformed from the patient woman who'd been trying to show her ID into something that carried the weight of command. "I apologize for the early arrival. I drove through the night and thought I'd get settled before the ceremony." "No apology necessary, ma'am." Patterson's salute remained locked. "It's an honor to have you here, ma'am. I just wish your arrival had been smoother." His eyes flicked toward the three recruits, and if looks could kill, Morrison, Chen, and Williams would have been vaporized on the spot. Sarah finally returned the salute and Patterson dropped his. The other soldiers emerging from the Humvees, a major, 2 captains, and several enlisted personnel, all stood at rigid attention, eyes forward. Morrison felt his legs trembling. The word general kept echoing in his head, but his brain couldn't process it. Generals didn't drive Honda Civics. Generals didn't wear ripped jeans. Generals didn't look like. And then it hit him, the full, horrible realization. They hadn't refused to help some random civilian. They'd refused entry to a 2-star general. They'd mocked her, called her Karen, threatened to have her arrested. He'd put his hands on her car. Chen had called in a hostile report. Williams had physically blocked her exit. Chen was making a sound like a small, wounded animal. Williams had his eyes squeezed shut, as if by not seeing he could make this all go away. Sergeant Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. "Ma'am, I was in the facilities. I didn't see. These recruits were assigned to gate duty as part of their training rotation, but I should have been." Sarah held up a hand and Rodriguez fell silent immediately. She looked at each of the 3 recruits in turn, her gaze steady and assessing. Morrison tried to meet her eyes but couldn't. The weight of her stare was too much. "At ease, Sergeant," Sarah said quietly. "We'll discuss the supervision protocols later." "Yes, ma'am." Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. Sarah turned to Colonel Patterson. "Colonel, I need these 3 privates' names, unit assignments, and service records sent to my office within the hour." "Immediately, ma'am." Patterson's voice was ice. "And arrange for a meeting in the base commander's temporary office in 30 minutes. These 3 will attend, along with Sergeant Rodriguez and yourself." "Yes, ma'am." Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, we didn't know." Sarah's gaze swung to him and the words died in his throat. Her expression wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was disappointed, analytical, like she was examining a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "Didn't know what, private?" Her voice was soft, but it carried. "Didn't know you should check identification before making assumptions. Didn't know you should treat every person with basic respect regardless of their appearance. Or didn't know that the military has been working for decades to move past the exact kind of prejudice you just demonstrated." Morrison opened his mouth, but nothing came out. 30 minutes, Sarah repeated to Patterson. "Get them cleaned up and in that office. We're going to have a conversation about assumptions, respect, and what it actually means to serve." She glanced back at her Honda Civic, then at the small overnight bag visible in the backseat. "And someone please direct me to my quarters. I need to change into my uniform before we have this discussion. I think it's important these 3 understand exactly who they were speaking to." "Yes, ma'am," Patterson said. "Captain Reeves will escort you directly." A young captain stepped forward, saluting sharply. Sarah returned it and moved toward one of the Humvees. As she passed the 3 recruits, she paused. "Gentlemen," she said softly, and all 3 flinched at the word. "I want you to spend the next 30 minutes thinking very carefully about everything you said and did this morning. Because when we meet in that office, you're going to explain to me, in detail, why you thought any of it was acceptable." She continued to the Humvee without looking back. Morrison, Chen, and Williams stood paralyzed, watching the convoy drive through the gate and disappear into the base. Around them, the normal morning sounds of Fort Bragg continued, birds chirping, distant cadences being called, the flag snapping in the breeze. Rodriguez finally moved, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "My office, now." The 3 recruits followed him like condemned men walking to the gallows, because that's exactly what they were. Sergeant Rodriguez's office was barely large enough for 1 person, let alone 4. The 3 recruits stood shoulder to shoulder against the wall, maintaining the position of attention even though Rodriguez hadn't ordered it. Their bodies were rigid, but inside, each of them was experiencing a private meltdown. Rodriguez sat at his desk, head in his hands, not even looking at them. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only 3 minutes. Finally, he looked up, and the expression on his face was something none of them had seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but genuine fear. "Do you have any idea," Rodriguez said slowly, each word deliberate, "what you've just done?" None of them answered. What could they possibly say? "Let me spell it out for you," Rodriguez continued, pulling up something on his computer. "That woman you just harassed, mocked, and physically threatened, that's Major General Sarah Mitchell, 2-star general, the new commanding general of the entire 82nd Airborne Division." He paused, letting that sink in. "She's the first woman to ever hold that position. The ceremony to officially hand her command is happening in 4 hours. The Secretary of the Army is flying in for it. The press is already setting up. And you 3 just gave her a welcome to Fort Bragg that will probably end up as a case study in what not to do in every leadership course for the next decade." Chen made a choking sound. Morrison had gone from pale to green. Williams was shaking visibly. "Her service record," Rodriguez continued, reading from his screen, "is beyond impressive. It's legendary. Enlisted in 1998, worked her way through OCS, commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in 2000. First deployment to Kosovo, then Afghanistan in 2002, then Iraq in 2004, where she was wounded twice in Fallujah, once in the shoulder, once in the leg, and kept fighting. She saved 3 soldiers that day and held a position against enemy fire until reinforcements arrived. That's where she earned her Silver Star." Morrison's knees were actually shaking now. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor," Rodriguez went on relentlessly. 3 Purple Hearts, Combat Infantry Badge, Master Parachutist Badge, Ranger Qualified, Airborne Qualified. She's commanded at every level from platoon to brigade in combat zones. She has a master's degree in strategic studies from the Army War College. And about 6 months ago, she was selected for promotion to Major General and assignment as CG of the 82nd. He finally looked up at them. "And you called her Karen. You told her to go back to Starbucks. You threatened to have her arrested." "Sarge, Morrison started, but Rodriguez cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You don't speak. You don't have anything worth saying right now. You stand there and you think about every single choice you made in the last 30 minutes. The office fell silent again. Through the thin walls, they could hear the normal sounds of the base coming to life, soldiers jogging by in formation, calling cadence. The world was continuing like nothing had happened, but for the 3 of them, everything had changed. Morrison's mind was racing through the encounter, seeing it now through a completely different lens. The way she'd stayed calm even when they'd been aggressive. The way she'd kept trying to show them her ID. The moment when her voice had dropped into what he now recognized as command authority, and he'd been too stupid, too arrogant to hear it. "She tried to tell us," Chen whispered, breaking the silence. "She kept trying to show us her ID. She ordered us to look at it, Williams added, his voice cracking. She actually gave us an order and we laughed at her. Rodriguez nodded slowly. That's exactly right. A two-star general gave you a direct order, and you not only refused it, you mocked her for it. Any idea what that's called? Insubordination, Morrison breathed. We could be court-martialed for that. Could be, Rodriguez laughed bitterly. Son, you're lucky if that's all that happens. You put your hands on a general's vehicle. Chen called in a false hostile report. Williams physically blocked a senior officer's exit. We're not talking about disciplinary action here. We're talking about the end of your military careers before they even started. The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical force. Morrison felt tears burning in his eyes. His grandfather, the Vietnam veteran who'd inspired him to enlist, was going to find out about this. The thought made him want to vomit. Chen was openly crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, and he'd thrown it away in 15 minutes of ego-driven stupidity. Williams was thinking about his brother, killed in action in Afghanistan 3 years ago. His brother who'd been a model soldier, who'd earned a Bronze Star, who'd made their family proud. And Williams had just disgraced that memory. A knock at the door made all 3 recruits jump. Enter, Rodriguez called. A young specialist stepped in. Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Patterson requests these 3 report to Temporary Command Building 7 in 15 minutes. He said they should use that time to make themselves presentable. Understood, Rodriguez stood. You 3, hit the latrine, wash your faces, and fix yourselves. You're about to stand in front of a general and account for your actions. I suggest you spend every second between now and then figuring out what you're going to say. 14 minutes later, Morrison, Chen, and Williams stood outside Temporary Command Building 7. It was a nondescript single-story structure used for meetings and administrative overflow. But right now, it felt like the entrance to hell. Through the window, they could see Colonel Patterson inside, standing at attention, and sitting behind the desk. Morrison's breath caught. General Mitchell had changed. Gone were the jeans and hoodie. In their place was the Army combat uniform, pressed and perfect. But it was what was on that uniform that made Morrison's chest constrict. Even from outside, he could see the array of ribbons on her chest, colors he was only beginning to learn. The bright blue of the Silver Star, the bronze V's on multiple ribbons indicating valor, the purple and white of the Purple Heart, and he could see there were 3 of them. On her shoulders, the 2 stars seemed to catch the fluorescent light and throw it back. Impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. This wasn't the tired woman from the Honda Civic. This was Major General Sarah Mitchell, and she looked every inch the warrior she was. We're so screwed, Chen whispered. No talking, Rodriguez hissed from behind them. He moved past them to the door, knocked once, and entered. Sir, ma'am, Privates Morrison, Chen, and Williams reporting as ordered. Send them in, Sergeant, came Colonel Patterson's voice. Rodriguez opened the door wider and gestured. The 3 recruits marched in, attempting to maintain some semblance of military bearing. They arranged themselves in a line in front of the desk, standing at attention, eyes forward. Sarah sat very still, studying each of them. The silence stretched for a long, uncomfortable moment. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally Sarah spoke, at ease. They shifted into the at ease position, but nothing about them was relaxed. If anything, the tension increased. Sarah stood slowly and walked around the desk to stand in front of them. Up close, her uniform was even more impressive. Morrison could now read the patches and tabs: Ranger, Airborne, Combat Infantry Badge, Master Parachutist Wings. Each one represented months or years of training, of proving herself over and over again. Do you know what these mean? Sarah asked quietly, pointing to the 3 purple hearts on her chest. Yes, ma'am, Morrison managed, his voice hoarse. They mean you were wounded in combat, ma'am. 3 times, Sarah said. Shot twice, shrapnel once. Do you know what this one means? She pointed to the silver star. Gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, ma'am, Chen said, his voice shaking. I was 27 years old, Sarah said. A captain commanding a company in Fallujah. We were ambushed. I'd already taken a round in the shoulder, but there were 3 of my soldiers pinned down by enemy fire. I could have waited for backup. I probably should have. But those were my soldiers, my responsibility, so I went back in. She paused. I got them out, got shot in the leg doing it. Nearly bled out before the medic reached me. Morrison felt tears threatening again. The woman they'd mocked, threatened, dismissed, she'd bled for soldiers she commanded. She'd nearly died protecting her people. Do you know how I survived? Sarah asked. None of them answered. A 19-year-old private named David Kowalski. He was a combat medic, terrified out of his mind, but he ran through enemy fire to reach me. He didn't care that I was a woman. He didn't care that I was an officer. He cared that I was a soldier who needed help. He saved my life. She let that hang in the air. That private understood something you 3 don't. In the military, we don't judge each other by gender or appearance or anything except our actions and our character. Sarah walked slowly in front of the 3 recruits, her boots clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Each step seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Colonel Patterson stood rigid near the door, his face carved from stone. Sergeant Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear into the wall. I want each of you, Sarah said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority, to tell me exactly what you did wrong this morning. And I don't want to hear we disrespected you or we didn't check your ID. I want you to think deeper. Private Morrison, you first. Morrison swallowed hard, his throat clicking. His mind raced. What did she want him to say? That he'd been rude, that he'd violated protocol. Then it hit him, the real answer, the one that made his stomach churn with shame. Ma'am, I made a judgment about who you were based on how you looked. His voice cracked. I saw a woman in regular clothes driving a regular car, and I decided you couldn't possibly be military. I didn't check your ID because I'd already decided you weren't worth my time. Sarah nodded slowly. Go on. I let my assumptions override my training. And worse, ma'am, I let my ego take control. When you tried to correct me, I saw it as a challenge to my authority instead of. He paused, the realization hitting him like a physical blow, instead of a superior officer trying to help me not make a terrible mistake. Private Chen, Sarah turned to him. Your turn. Chen's voice was thick with tears he was barely holding back. Ma'am, I participated in the harassment because I wanted to fit in. Morrison was being aggressive, and instead of doing the right thing, I joined in. I made it worse. I called you hostile on the radio, which was a false report. And I did it because... He stopped, struggling with the words. Because why, Private? Because it felt good, ma'am, Chen admitted, his voice breaking. Because for the first time since I got here, I felt powerful, and I used that power to hurt someone instead of to serve. Sarah's expression softened slightly, not much, but enough that Chen saw it. She turned to Williams. Private Williams. Williams's voice was steady, but his eyes were haunted. Ma'am, my brother died in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, Jr. He was a squad leader, Bronze Star recipient. He wrote me letters from deployment, told me about the Army values, about honor and respect. His jaw clenched. This morning, I disgraced his memory. I physically blocked your vehicle. I laughed when my fellow soldiers mocked you. And the worst part, ma'am, is that I know exactly why I did it. Tell me. Because I'm scared, ma'am. The admission seemed to cost him. I'm terrified I won't measure up to my brother, that I'll fail. And when Morrison started acting tough, it felt easier to be part of that than to be the one who stood up and did the right thing. I took the coward's path. The room fell silent. Sarah studied each of them, and Morrison realized she wasn't just angry, she was evaluating them, the way a commander evaluates soldiers before a mission. Do you know why I joined the Army? Sarah asked suddenly. The question caught them all off guard. None of them answered. I was 21 years old, working as a waitress in a diner in Ohio. I had no direction, no purpose. My father had walked out when I was 10. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. I watched her break herself for years until she literally worked herself to death, heart attack at 52. Sarah's voice was steady, but there was emotion beneath it. I enlisted a week after her funeral. The Army gave me structure, purpose, a family. It saved my life. She moved to the window, looking out at the base beyond. But it wasn't easy. When I got to my first unit as a brand new second lieutenant, I had a platoon sergeant who refused to take orders from me. He'd literally ignore me in front of the troops, then turn to my male XO and say, "What are we really doing today, sir?" Morrison felt a stab of recognition at that story. I had a battalion commander who called me sweetheart in meetings and patted my head like I was a child. I had fellow officers who assumed I'd slept my way into OCS. And I had soldiers, enlisted troops who should have had my back, who made crude jokes about my body in formations where I could hear them. She turned back to face them. But here's what you need to understand. Those people, they were the minority. For every person who doubted me, there were 10 who judged me by my actions. For every commander who dismissed me, there was one who mentored me and pushed me to be better. Captain, later Colonel, later General James fucking Patterson over there. She gestured toward Patterson, who hadn't moved. He was my battalion commander in Afghanistan. He recommended me for command when others said I wasn't ready. He wrote the evaluation that put me on the path to where I am today. Patterson's face showed the briefest flicker of emotion, pride. The Army has come a long way, Sarah continued. When I enlisted in 1998, women couldn't serve in direct combat roles. We were excluded from infantry, armor, special operations. It wasn't until 2016 that all combat positions opened to women. I was already a colonel by then, but I went through Ranger School anyway, at 40 years old, because I wanted to prove it could be done. She stepped closer to the 3 recruits again. I've spent 27 years fighting 2 battles, the external one against our nation's enemies and the internal one against prejudice and assumption. And this morning, you 3 showed me that the second battle isn't over, that we still have soldiers who judge based on appearance, who let ego override training, who abuse the tiny amount of power they're given. Morrison felt like he was being stripped down to nothing. Every word hit home. But here's the thing, Sarah said, and her tone shifted slightly. I don't think you're bad people. I think you're ignorant people who made terrible choices, and there's a difference. Williams looked up confused. Ma'am. 25 years ago, when I was a new lieutenant in Kosovo, I made a racist comment about the local population. I didn't think it was racist at the time. I thought I was just being realistic. My company commander was a black captain named Marcus Henderson. He heard what I said. Sarah's voice grew quiet. He could have reported me, could have destroyed my career before it started. Instead, he invited me to dinner with his family. Let me see him as a father, a husband, a human being. He spent hours explaining to me how my realistic comment was actually a prejudice learned from a lifetime of subtle messaging. It changed my life. She looked at each of them in turn. So now I'm going to ask you 3 a question, and I want honest answers. Why did you join the military? Morrison went first. My grandfather, ma'am. He served in Vietnam, came back a different man. He never talked much about it, but I saw his photos, his medals. He died 2 years ago, and at his funeral, men came from all over the country to honor him. I wanted to be part of something that mattered like that. Chen wiped his eyes. My parents came from Taiwan with almost nothing, ma'am. They worked in restaurants, barely spoke English. The Army is giving me a chance at college, at a future they couldn't afford. I wanted to serve the country that gave my family hope. Williams's voice was soft. I wanted to honor my brother, ma'am, to finish what he started, to make sure his sacrifice meant something. Sarah nodded slowly, and for the first time something like warmth entered her expression. Those are good reasons, honorable reasons. You came here wanting to be part of something bigger than yourselves. She sat on the edge of the desk. So here's what's going to happen. Sarah remained perched on the edge of the desk, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. The three recruits stood frozen, waiting for the hammer to fall. Behind them, Colonel Patterson and Sergeant Rodriguez exchanged glances, equally uncertain about where this was heading. By regulation, Sarah began, I could have each of you court-martialed. Insubordination, making a false report, interfering with a senior officer in performance of their duties. Your military careers could end before lunch today. Morrison felt his knees weaken. Chen's breathing became shallow and rapid. Williams closed his eyes. Or, Sarah continued, I could go the administrative route. Article 15's reduction in rank, which for you means going from E1 to, well, nothing. Dishonorable discharge. You'd go home with nothing but a black mark that would follow you for the rest of your lives. The silence was suffocating. Is that what you want? Sarah asked. To throw away everything you came here to build, to disappoint everyone who believed in you? No, ma'am, all three said in unison, their voices cracking. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at Fort Bragg. The sun was higher now, and she could see formations of soldiers running PT, hear the distant sound of cadences being called. The base was waking up, moving forward with its mission. The easy thing, she said, still looking out the window, would be to destroy you three, make an example, send a message to the entire base that this behavior won't be tolerated. She turned back to face them. But I didn't survive 27 years in the Army by taking easy paths, and I don't think destroying you actually solves the problem. Morrison dared to look up, confusion mixing with his fear. The problem, Sarah explained, isn't just three ignorant recruits at a gate. The problem is a culture that allowed you to think your behavior was acceptable. It's the accumulation of movies, TV shows, casual comments, and 1,000 tiny moments that taught you women in positions of power are unusual, suspicious, or somehow less legitimate than men. She moved back to stand directly in front of them. So here's my offer, and you can refuse it. If you want the traditional punishment route, I'll arrange it. But if you want to actually learn something, actually become the soldiers you said you wanted to be when you enlisted, I have an alternative. Ma'am, Chen's voice was barely a whisper. For the next 60 days, you three belong to me. You'll shadow me everywhere I go. Every meeting, every inspection, every command decision, every interaction. You'll see what it's like to be constantly questioned, constantly doubted, constantly having to prove yourself. Williams's eyes widened. This wasn't what any of them expected. You'll also interview 50 people on this base, and I don't care how long it takes. Women, minorities, soldiers who have been underestimated or dismissed because of who they are rather than what they can do. You'll document their stories. You'll learn their experiences. And at the end of 60 days, you'll compile everything into a report. A report, ma'am, Morrison asked carefully. A comprehensive analysis of bias in military culture, with specific recommendations for training improvements. That report will be presented to the base leadership, and if it's good enough, it'll go up the chain to division command. Sarah crossed her arms. Your 60 days will also include attending every single leadership and diversity seminar on this base. You'll be enrolled in additional ethics training. And you'll spend 20 hours each week doing community service, helping military families, working at the base childcare center, assisting in the USO center. Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up. This was unprecedented. But here's the catch, Sarah continued. You'll do all of this in addition to your normal training schedule. You won't get special treatment. You won't get extra sleep. You're going to work harder than you've ever worked in your lives. And if at any point you fail to meet standards in your regular training or in this special assignment, the deal is off and we go straight to court-martial. Understood? Yes, ma'am, they said together, though Morrison noticed his voice was shaking. One more thing, Sarah said. This incident doesn't disappear from your service records. It goes in as a formal counseling statement. It'll be there for your entire careers. Every time you're up for promotion, every time you apply for a special school or assignment, this will be part of your file. You'll carry this with you." The weight of that settled over them like a lead blanket. "Now," Sarah said, her voice softening just slightly, "I want to know why. Private Morrison, tell me honestly, why are you willing to accept this?" Morrison thought about his grandfather, about the funeral where all those veterans had come to pay respects. He thought about the disappointment he'd see in those old soldiers' eyes if they knew what he'd done. "Because I came here to be a soldier, ma'am," Morrison said, his voice steady for the first time. "Not just someone wearing a uniform, a real soldier like my grandfather. And I can't be that person if I don't fix what's broken inside me. I don't want to just avoid punishment. I want to understand why I was wrong and how to be better." Sarah nodded, something almost like approval in her eyes. Private Chen. "Ma'am, my parents didn't escape poverty and cross an ocean so I could become the kind of person who abuses power and mocks people." Chen's voice grew stronger. "They taught me to respect everyone, and I forgot that lesson. I need to learn it again properly this time, not just in my head but in my heart." Private Williams. Williams took a shaky breath. "My brother died protecting people, ma'am. He died serving something bigger than himself. This morning I served nothing but my own ego and fear. I need to become someone who would make him proud, not just to wear the uniform but to deserve it." Sarah studied each of them for a long moment. Then she looked at Patterson. "Colonel, do you have any objections to this plan?" Patterson's expression was unreadable. "Ma'am, it's highly irregular, but I've served under your command before and I trust your judgment. If you believe these three can be salvaged, then I support the effort." Sergeant Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked at the three recruits, then at Sarah. "Ma'am, I should be part of their training as well. I was their supervisor. Their failure is partly mine." Sarah considered this. "Agreed. You'll serve as their direct mentor throughout this process. You'll report their progress to me weekly." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah turned back to the recruits. "Last chance to back out. This will be the hardest 60 days of your lives. You'll be exhausted, humiliated, and pushed to your absolute limits. The court-martial might actually be easier." Morrison thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "I accept your offer, ma'am." "I accept, ma'am," Chen said immediately after. "I accept, ma'am," Williams added. Sarah pulled 3 folders from the desk drawer. She'd prepared them before the meeting, Morrison realized. She'd already decided to give them this chance. "These are your assignment packets. Your first task starts in 2 hours after my change of command ceremony. You'll be present for that ceremony in proper dress uniform. After that, you report to the Base Education Center for your first seminar." She handed each of them a folder. "Don't make me regret this." "We won't, ma'am," they said in unison. Dismissed. Day 1, the change of command ceremony. Morrison stood in his dress uniform, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. He was positioned with the other junior enlisted soldiers, but he felt like everyone was staring at him. Word had spread fast about what happened at the gate. Whispers followed him everywhere. The parade ground at Fort Bragg was immaculate. 3,000 soldiers stood in perfect formation. Dignitaries filled the reviewing stand. News cameras lined the perimeter. And there, on the platform, stood General Sarah Mitchell in her dress blues, every medal gleaming in the sunlight. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. The outgoing commander relinquished authority. The division colors were passed, and when Sarah stepped forward to accept command, her voice carried across the entire field without amplification, strong and clear. "Soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division," she began. "It is the greatest honor of my life to stand before you today, not because I'm the first woman to command this division, though I'm proud of that, but because I'm joining a legacy of warriors that stretches back to 1917. Morrison listened to every word. This was the woman he'd called Karen, the woman he'd threatened, and she was speaking about sacrifice, about service, about the responsibility of command with a depth of understanding that made his earlier arrogance feel like a child's tantrum. When the ceremony ended and the troops were dismissed, Morrison, Chen, and Williams were directed to follow General Mitchell. They walked 3 paces behind her as she navigated the crowd of well-wishers and reporters. Morrison watched as she shook hands, smiled for photos, and graciously accepted congratulations, all while maintaining absolute professionalism. But he also noticed the other things. The way some of the older officers' smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. The reporter who asked if she thought she could handle the physical demands of commanding an airborne division. The general from another base who called her young lady, despite her 2 stars and his matching rank. And he watched how Sarah handled each moment with grace and steel. Week 2, the first interviews. Tell me about a time when you felt dismissed because of your gender, Chen said to Captain Maria Rodriguez, reading from his interview questions. Captain Rodriguez, an intelligence officer with 12 years of service, laughed without humor. Which time? There are hundreds. They were sitting in her office, and Chen had his notebook ready. William sat beside him, also taking notes. This was their 15th interview, and each one had been like a punch to the gut. The one that stands out, Rodriguez continued, was in Afghanistan. I'd spent weeks analyzing intelligence patterns, and I identified a network of IED placements. I brought my findings to the briefing, laid out the evidence, made my recommendations. My battalion commander literally fell asleep during my presentation. Chen stopped writing. He fell asleep. Snored even, Rodriguez said with a bitter smile. Then, the next day, one of my male colleagues presented the exact same information, my analysis, my recommendations, my words, and suddenly it was brilliant. They implemented everything immediately. What did you do? Williams asked. I did my job, Rodriguez said simply. Because at the end of the day, the mission mattered more than my ego, but it hurt. It still hurts. After the interview, Chen and Williams walked back to their barracks in silence. Finally, Williams spoke. We did that to her, to General Mitchell. We dismissed everything she said because of what she looked like. Chen nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Week 4, shadowing the general. Morrison stood at the back of the conference room, trying to be invisible. General Mitchell sat at the head of the table with 15 senior officers, all men except for her and 1 female colonel. They were discussing readiness reports and deployment schedules. With respect, ma'am, a full-bird colonel said, and Morrison had learned that, with respect, usually meant the opposite. I'm not sure your timeline is realistic. The men need more preparation. The soldiers, Sarah corrected gently but firmly. Not men, soldiers. We have women in combat roles now, Colonel. Right, of course, the colonel said, but his tone suggested he didn't really agree. The soldiers need at least 6 more weeks. Your report shows 85% readiness, Sarah countered. That's above the threshold for deployment. Can you explain the discrepancy? The colonel's face reddened. Ma'am, I just think. Colonel, I'm not asking what you think. I'm asking you to reconcile your verbal assessment with your written report. If there's a real readiness issue, we address it. If there isn't, we move forward as planned. The room fell silent. The colonel had no answer because there was no discrepancy. He simply didn't want to follow her directive. We'll proceed as planned, Sarah said. Next item. After the meeting, as Morrison followed Sarah back to her office, she suddenly stopped and turned to him. What did you observe, Private? Morrison was caught off guard. Ma'am. In that meeting, what did you see? He thought carefully. I saw Colonel Henderson try to undermine your decision, ma'am. Not because the decision was wrong, but because he didn't want to follow orders from you. Sarah nodded. And how did I handle it? You didn't get emotional, you used facts. You gave him a chance to provide evidence, and when he couldn't, you moved forward. You were professional. Being professional is the only option I have, Sarah said quietly. If I show anger, I'm emotional. If I'm firm, I'm a bitch. If I ask questions, I'm uncertain. I have to be perfect in every interaction, while the men in that room can be mediocre and still be respected. She looked at him directly. That's not a complaint, Private. That's reality. And now you've seen it. Week 6, the breaking point. It was 2 a.m., and Chen was crying in the barracks bathroom. The physical exhaustion was crushing. Regular training, combined with the general's special assignment, meant he was averaging 4 hours of sleep a night. But it was the emotional weight that had finally broken him. Williams found him there. "Hey, man." "I can't do this," Chen sobbed. "It's too much. Every interview, every story, it's like carrying weights on my chest." Staff Sergeant Jenkins talked about how her squad refused to follow her orders in combat and nearly got people killed. Lieutenant Harris described being sexually assaulted by a fellow officer and not reporting it because she knew no one would believe her. And all I can think is that we're part of the problem. We're why they have to be twice as good to get half the respect. Williams sat down next to him on the floor. "I know. I interviewed Specialist Thompson yesterday. She's been in for 8 years, deployed 3 times, has a combat action badge. And soldiers still ask if she can handle carrying a ruck, like she hasn't proven herself 100 times over." "How do we fix it?" Chen asked desperately. "How do we make it right?" "I don't know if we can fix it," Williams said honestly. "But maybe we can be better. Maybe that's all we can do, be better than we were, and call it out when we see others doing what we did." Morrison appeared in the doorway, also unable to sleep. He'd overheard the conversation. "General Mitchell said something to me today. She said the goal isn't to stop being wrong. We're all going to make mistakes. The goal is to stay uncomfortable, to never let ourselves get comfortable with prejudice." The 3 of them sat there in the fluorescent bathroom light, exhausted and humbled, carrying the weight of lessons that couldn't be unlearned. Week 8, the report. The 3 recruits sat surrounded by papers, laptops, and 50 recorded interviews. They'd been working on their report for 2 weeks, and it was brutally honest. More honest than they'd expected to be. "We need to include our own story," Morrison said suddenly. "What happened at the gate? We can't write about bias in the military and pretend we weren't part of it." Chen and Williams looked at each other, then nodded. "It's going to be public," Williams warned. "Everyone will know what we did." "They already know," Morrison replied. "And we owe it to every person we interviewed to be as honest as they were with us." They wrote through the night, documenting everything they'd learned, including their own failure and transformation. Day 60, the final presentation. The base theater was packed with over 300 soldiers, ranging from privates to colonels. General Mitchell sat in the front row, flanked by Colonel Patterson and the division command staff. Word had spread about the report, and about the 3 recruits who'd made international headlines by harassing their new commanding general on her first day. Morrison, Chen, and Williams stood backstage, all in dress uniform, all terrified. "We can do this," Morrison said, though his hands were shaking as he held his notes. "We've interviewed 50 people, written 100 pages, and lived this for 60 days. We know this material." "It's not the material I'm worried about," Chen admitted. "It's facing everyone after what we did." Williams straightened his uniform one more time. "Then we face it. That's what soldiers do." The curtain rose, and the 3 of them walked onto the stage. The murmur of conversation died instantly. Morrison stepped to the microphone first, and his voice carried clearly through the sound system. "Good afternoon. My name is Private First Class Jake Morrison." He paused, then added, 60 days ago, I harassed, mocked, and threatened to arrest Major General Sarah Mitchell at the main gate of this installation, because I assumed a woman in civilian clothes couldn't possibly be a general officer." The directness of the admission sent a ripple through the audience. Chen stepped forward. "I'm Private First Class Tyler Chen. I participated in that harassment, called in a false hostile report, and laughed while my commanding general was disrespected." Williams took his place at the third microphone. "I'm Private First Class Marcus Williams. I physically blocked General Mitchell's vehicle and made jokes about her appearance and authority." The theater was dead silent. "We were given a choice," Morrison continued. "Face court-martial or spend 60 days learning why what we did was symptomatic of a larger problem in military culture. We chose the education. What we learned changed our lives." For the next 45 minutes, the three of them presented their findings. They showed video clips from their interviews, soldiers breaking down while describing experiences of discrimination, harassment, and dismissal. They presented statistics about retention rates for women and minorities, about the gaps in leadership representation, about incidents that went unreported because victims knew they wouldn't be believed. And they didn't shy away from their own culpability. "We are not victims of this system," Williams said firmly. "We are products of it and perpetrators of it. Every movie that showed women as weak, every joke we laughed at that diminished someone's service, every time we stayed silent when someone was being treated unfairly, all of that led to that morning at the gate." Chen advanced the presentation to their recommendations section. "We propose mandatory bias training that goes beyond checking boxes. We recommend mentorship programs pairing junior soldiers with senior leaders across gender and racial lines. We suggest anonymous reporting systems for discrimination with real consequences for violators." Morrison brought up the final slide, a photo of the three of them at the gate where it had all happened. "But the most important recommendation we have is this: stay uncomfortable. Don't let yourself get complacent. Don't let yourself assume. Question your own biases every single day." The presentation ended, and for a moment no one moved. Then Staff Sergeant Jenkins, one of their interviewees, stood up and began clapping. Captain Rodriguez joined her, then Lieutenant Harris. Within seconds, the entire theater was on its feet. Morrison felt tears burning in his eyes, but they weren't tears of shame anymore. They were something else entirely. 3 months later, base commendation ceremony. The parade ground was set up again, but this was a smaller ceremony, just the division staff and a few select troops. General Mitchell stood at the podium, the December sun warm on her shoulders. "Leadership," she began, "is not about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after you make them. Today, I'm recognizing 3 soldiers who made a terrible mistake and chose the hard path of genuine growth over the easy path of excuses." Morrison, Chen, and Williams marched forward to stand before her. Their uniforms were immaculate, their bearing strong, but their expressions carried a humility that hadn't been there 4 months ago. "Private First Class Morrison, Private First Class Chen, Private First Class Williams," Sarah's voice carried across the field. "In recognition of your work developing comprehensive anti-bias training protocols that have been adopted not just by this division, but Army-wide, and for your exceptional dedication to understanding and combating prejudice in military culture, I present each of you with the Army Commendation Medal." As she pinned the medals to their chests, she spoke quietly so only they could hear. "Your grandfather would be proud," she told Morrison. "Your parents would be proud," she said to Chen. "Your brother would be proud," she told Williams. All 3 had to blink back tears. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Sarah walked with the 3 of them back toward the main gate, the site where it had all begun. A new plaque had been installed there, bronze and permanent. "Check your assumptions here. Respect everyone, verify everything. Trust but confirm, serve with honor." Below it in smaller letters, "Dedicated to the principle that service transcends appearance, gender, race, and assumption. We are all soldiers first." "You did that?" Morrison asked, staring at the plaque. "The division command approved it," Sarah said. "But the words came from your report. You three took the worst moment of your military careers and turned it into something that will teach soldiers for generations. That's not just redemption, that's leadership." Chen wiped his eyes. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you give us the chance? Really, you could have ended our careers." Sarah looked at the gate, remembering that morning 4 months ago. "Because 25 years ago I made a racist comment born from ignorance. My commanding officer could have destroyed me. Instead, he taught me. He invested in my growth because he believed people could change." She turned to face them. "But I'll be honest, I also did it because I was angry, furious, and I wanted you to understand, truly understand what you'd done. I wanted it to hurt." "It did, ma'am," William said quietly. "It still does every day." "Good," Sarah said, but her voice was gentle. "That means you're learning. The day it stops hurting is the day you stop growing." Morrison looked at his fellow soldiers. No longer the cocky, ignorant recruits who'd stood at this gate in August, but men who'd been broken down and rebuilt into something better. "Ma'am, we've been talking, and we want to keep doing the interviews, keep updating the report. Make it an ongoing project." Sarah smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Permission granted. In fact, I'm assigning Sergeant Rodriguez to work with you on expanding it into a full training curriculum." 6 months later, the story of the Gate 3 incident had become something of a legend at Fort Bragg, but not in the way Morrison had feared. It wasn't whispered as a cautionary tale of career-ending stupidity. Instead, it was taught in every leadership course as an example of accountability, growth, and genuine change. Morrison stood at that same gate now, but this time wearing the armband of an MP supervisor. He was training new gate guards, teaching them the importance of procedure, respect, and verification. A car approached, a woman in civilian clothes behind the wheel. The new recruit started to wave her through the civilian gate. "Hold on," Morrison said calmly. "What's the first thing you do?" "Check identification, sir," the recruit said, catching himself. "Always no assumptions, no exceptions." The woman rolled down her window with a knowing smile, a major in civilian clothes coming from a meeting in town. She handed over her ID without being asked. The recruit checked it thoroughly, professional and respectful, then waved her through with a proper salute. "Well done," Morrison said. "That's how it's supposed to work." As the car drove through, Morrison looked up at the plaque above the gate. 4 words caught the sunlight: respect everyone, verify everything. He'd learned those words the hard way, but he'd learned them, and now, every single day, he made sure others learned them the right way. Inside her office, General Mitchell looked out her window at the main gate in the distance. She thought about those 3 terrified recruits from 8 months ago, now thriving soldiers who were making a real difference. She thought about the colonel who'd given her a second chance 25 years earlier. And she thought about the ongoing work of building a military, building a world, where people were judged by their character and their actions, not by their appearance or their gender. It was hard work. It would always be hard work. But watching Morrison at that gate, teaching the next generation to be better than he'd been, that made it worth it. Sarah smiled and turned back to her desk. There was always more work to do. Always another lesson to teach. Always another soldier to lift up. And that, more than anything, was what it meant to lead. The end.